Hi everyone, we're officially starting. Welcome to everyone here and welcome to our online side event to the Human Rights Council 44th session titled Human Rights Situation in the Philippines, Civil Society Reactions to the UN High Commissioner's Report. This online side event is organized by the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, in Defense of Human Rights and Dignity Movement, and the World Organization Against Torture. I'm Joy, I'm from Forum Asia, and I'll be your moderator for this event. Just as a quick background, during the 41st session of the Human Rights Council last year, the Council voted on a resolution mandating the OHCHR to draft a report on the human rights situation in the Philippines. The report was discussed earlier last week as part of the 44th session. The OHCHR report detailed widespread human rights violations and persistent impunity, and particularly the systematic killings of alleged drug users. It highlighted attacks against civic space, vilification and attacks against human rights defenders, the media, and the curtailment of dissent. It also raised inconsistencies about the police officers' narratives in the war on drugs and attributed these violations to a heavy focus on countering national security threats and illegal drugs. Recommendations included the need for prompt, impartial, thorough, and transparent investigations into all killings and the continued monitoring by the OHCHR. It also asked the Human Rights Council to support international accountability measures should domestic mechanisms fail. More than 40 states participated in the enhanced interactive dialogue last June 30. The Philippine government, through Secretary of Justice Menard Guevara, argued that there was no reasonable basis to allege impunity or lack of accountability for human rights violations. In its own situationer, the Philippine government also denied the extent of human rights violations and claimed that the Philippines was committed to the protection of human rights. A joint statement by 31 special procedures mandate holders reiterated their call for an on-the-ground, independent international investigation in the Philippines. In this side event, we will hear from human rights defenders in the Philippines. We have Judy Pasimio, Rose Trajano, Father Christian Buenafe, Attorney Chel Jokno, and Commissioner Karen Dumpit. This event will gather perspectives on all these developments and raise questions of what's next in terms of accountability and the role of the international community. We are joined in this room by members of the diplomatic community, international and Philippine-based civil society, and the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. For those joining us, you can leave your questions in the chat box. If you would also want to speak, we may be able to give you speaker access should we have enough time to do so. And just let us know. So you should be able to see a chat box on the right part of the screen. You can leave your questions there. We're also being live streamed in the Facebook pages of Forum Asia, iDefend, and the Commission on Human Rights. Okay. So to start formally our discussion, we have Judy Pasimio, who is the spokesperson of the In Defense of Human Rights and Dignity Movement, or iDefend. She's also the coordinator of LILAC, Purple Action for Indigenous Women's Rights. LILAC is an organization of Indigenous women leaders, as well as feminists, anthropologists, human rights advocates, environmentalists, and lawyers who support the struggle for Indigenous women's human rights. So if we could invite Judy to start for us.
Good afternoon, good day, everyone. One of the most striking points in the report is that it has, in the Philippine report by the Duterte government in May 2020, the human rights situation that it has put out, it has affirmed what has been stated in the report of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I quote, "The human rights situation in the Philippines is marked by an overarching focus on public order and national security, including countering terrorism and illegal drugs. This focus has permeated the implementation of existing laws and policies and the adoption of new measures, often at the expense of human rights, due process rights, and the rule of law and accountability." In the human rights situation, the Philippine government devoted a whole chapter on providing the context of the country, which is focused on the threats of insurgency, and a few pages thereafter of terrorism. This is the context, according to the report, that human rights situation should be understood. Basically, the report's assertion is that the human rights violations being cited and reported are all allegations by Communist Front, Communist organized, Communist supported organizations to vilify the government and its efforts to end insurgency and terrorism. Therefore, it asserts no truth to these violations. We are at war. This is what the Duterte government wants us to accept. And in war, sacrifices have to be made. Your concern is about human rights. Mine is human lives, Duterte said in his 2018 State of the Nation address. This is how he justifies the thousands of killings in his war on drugs. To end local communist insurgency, or the, the Duterte government's policies and programs, such as the Executive Order 70 or the whole of nation approach to end local communist insurgency, or the Security and Exchange Commission Memorandum Circular Number 15, which can potentially be used for surveillance of civil society organizations and the communities they work with, cybercrime law, and the anti-terrorism law, all of which are designed to gain access to organizations and communities for surveillance, to threaten and silence the growing opposition and dissent against this government. All these are justified because we are at war against communism, against terrorism. Since day one, this is what Duterte and his government wants us to have: fear. And with fear, Duterte wants the Filipinos to accept this strongman rule and give him more power. Duterte declared national state of emergency, martial law in Mindanao, and now even in pandemic, he has asked and was granted emergency powers. Then a few days ago, the anti-terror became law, which gives so much discretion to the state security forces as to who is a terrorist and what is a terrorist act, and breaking down safeguards that we had for human rights. This peddling of fear and the need for a strongman rule play very well to his authoritarian agenda, as well as the corporate-led development framework. The latter is what is being obscured in the human rights situation of the government. As the economy of the Philippines is growing, so is the inequality in our society. The wealth is concentrated in the hands and pockets of a few men: Manny Villar, Enrique Razon, the C siblings, Ramon Ang, Hoangco. In December 2019, and this is pre-COVID-19, according to Social Weather Station, 54% of Filipino families considered themselves poor, the highest self-rated poverty recorded in 5 years. And we expect a dramatic increase of number of poor families as we experience now the impacts of the lockdown because of COVID-19. The authoritarian rule of Duterte should be seen hand in hand with this economic agenda, and that is to pursue a development model that would benefit corporations heavily relying on the commodification of our natural resources, which leads to further degradation of our environment, adversely contributing to climate change, and impoverishing the communities who are primarily dependent on our natural resources. In the discussion of the indigenous people's rights situation, the Philippine report portrays the indigenous communities as if they're helpless people caught in between the fight of the communist insurgents and the state forces. It is as if the only forces at play within the ancestral domains are the CPP, NPA on one hand, and the Philippine Army on the other. But our experiences show that indigenous peoples are active targets by the state forces. Why? Because it is within their ancestral domains and therefore within their governance that the natural resources that both the corporations and the Duterte cronies are making profit from: timber, minerals, watersheds, rivers, and the land that they live on. The indigenous peoples, who are farmers, fishers, gardeners, agricultural workers, have been actively defending their lands and their domains from these land grabbers and encroachers. That is why, in their fight for their rights, they have been labeled as communist sympathizers or communists themselves. Datu Victor Danyan and 7 other members of his tribe were killed in December 2017. The military said they were killed in an encounter, alleging that they were members of the New People's Army. But Dato Victor and his community has long been fighting against a coffee plantation within their ancestral domain, allowed by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. The community members of Barangay Didipio, Cebu, Nueva Vizcaya have been experiencing time and again red tagging or being branded as communists, now terrorists, because of their continued fight against Oceana gold mining in their community. In Maguindanao, hundreds hundreds of Tidurayan Lambangian families have evacuated from their communities as armed Moro groups would open fire, burn their houses, and threaten them so that they would leave their lands. Since 2018, the list of community leaders being killed has been growing. Meanwhile, oil palm plantation companies are eagerly awaiting for them to start their operations. In 2019, Philippines was declared the most dangerous place for land rights and environmental defenders. In the Philippine report, it was said that the Kaliwa Dam is currently on hold because they respect free and prior informed consent of the indigenous peoples. The Kaliwa Dam, which will affect hundreds of families of Dumagat and Remontado in Sierra Madre, and there's a lot of opposition among the indigenous communities. However, in real life, outside the report, Duterte actually said that he will use extraordinary powers to make sure that the dam will push through. When Duterte said this about Kaliwa Dam, it has been observed that military presence in the Sierra Madre has increased. And we know that Duterte's words are law, are direct orders, are drivers of acts of human rights violations. The UN Human Rights Report has described the harmful rhetoric as pervasive and deeply damaging. We remember when Duterte was asked by soldiers last year, what do we do when we capture a female rebel? He said, shoot her in the vagina. Months thereafter, in April last year, Cindy Tirado, an alleged NPA, was found dead with her genitals shattered by bullets. The violent nature of this government is undeniable, and over the years it has proven that it means to prop itself up as an authoritarian with deep interest and control over our natural resources. In the beginning, he said that he can easily drive mining corporations away because of environmental destruction, but he has not. In fact, during the lockdown, the DNR has allowed the continuation of operations of mining companies despite lack of free, prior, and informed consent, despite expired permits and opposition from the communities. The DNR has declared now that mining will be used for economic recovery. The two mega dams, which were shelved by earlier administrations because of strong opposition, are now under Duterte in construction stage. Chico and Kaliwa Dam, both with Chinese money. Then you have the militarized bureaucracy, which is an additional barrier to access remedy and justice. You have, especially for indigenous peoples, you have a military as commissioner of chair of the commission of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the secretary for the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and the secretary for the Department of Social Welfare and Development. As Michelle Bachelet said in her report, there are formidable barriers to access of justice. With the economic impacts of COVID-19, women from the indigenous communities are more vulnerable than ever, with a burden on their shoulders getting heavier by the day, food insecurity, fear of COVID-19, and how they will be able to cope should the disease strike their communities far away from any health services from the government. Violence around them with land grabbers, increased military presence in their areas. That is why we welcome this report by the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights and its recommendations, as we need more eyes to see the real situation of human rights in our country and more voices to raise concerns. And join us as we push for demilitarizing our governance system and we break state impunity. But we also demand corporate accountability and we enjoin different people's movements and different governments to support the process towards a legally binding treaty instrument to ensure corporate accountability. I will end here now so that we can have discussions later. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Judy, for speaking about the economic agenda of this government and the state of indigenous peoples. If I can invite our next speaker. So our second speaker is a well-known human rights lawyer we fondly call Attorney Chel. Attorney Jose Manuel Chel Jokno is the chairman of the Free Legal Assistance Group, Assistance Group, and the founding dean of the De La Salle University College of Law. Flag is known for fighting for justice for victims and for those in need. He has fought for the rights of indigenous peoples, fisher folk, writers, and socially, economically deprived individuals and communities. If we could invite Attorney Chell to speak. And if we could ask Hanong to give Attorney Chell panelists access. Chell Diokno. Just give us a minute, Attorney Chell. Attorney Chell,
There you are.
yes.
Good day to
Welcome po.
everyone. Thank you. Good day to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts on several very important human rights issues in the Philippines. I've been asked to speak primarily on the war on drugs, which was also featured very much in the UN Office of the High Commissioner's Human Rights Report. The war on drugs in the Philippines began on July 1, 2016, the day after President Duterte assumed the office as the President of the Philippines, and continues until today. We don't know when this war on drugs will end, probably when this administration steps down, or whenever that will be. But this is what I can tell you about the war on drugs. The war on drugs was operationalized by a circular signed by then PNP Chief De La Rosa on July 1, 2016. That's Command Memorandum Circular 16-2016. And it is this circular that gave life to all the operations conducted by the police, as well as the EJ case that took place in the name of the war on drugs. Nobody really knows how many people have been killed in the war on drugs because the government at some point stopped counting. I think they became too embarrassed to admit the numbers. But this is what I can tell you based on official reports. Based on a resolution issued by the Supreme Court of the Philippines from July 1, 2016 up to November 27, 2017. So that is only a period of roughly 17 months. There were already 20,322 persons killed in the war on drugs. Of these 20,322 persons killed, 3,967 were killed in police operations, and the bulk, 16,355, were killed by unknown persons, most of them supposedly riding in tandem. Since that time, around in December of 2017, the government stopped releasing or changed its way of counting the number of people that had been killed in the war on drugs and in a way that makes it now impossible to really keep track and to have a to have a reliable number of how many people have really been killed in the war on drugs. But I can tell you that the war on drugs continues even today under the pandemic. We are still receiving reports of persons being killed in who are allegedly involved in drugs. How was the war on drugs operationalized? Well, it was operationalized in two ways. The war on drugs circular that I mentioned earlier required the Philippine National Police to work with the local government officials to come up with drug lists. And these drug lists were then used as basis for police operations. And not to our surprise, these people whose names appeared on this drug list were also targeted by vigilantes who, many of whom were riding in tandem and who committed extrajudicial killings pretty much every day for the first several years of the war on drugs. The In response to the killings, several groups filed petitions. The Free Legal Assistance Group, which I headed, filed a petition on behalf of the relatives of three victims of the war on drugs before our Supreme Court. The case was heard in oral argument in December of 2017 and is still pending today. During that period of time, the court had directed the government through the Office of the Solicitor General to submit information to the court about the war on drugs. How many people had been killed, how many of the police units were involved, who were involved among the police units, had any investigations been done of persons killed while under police custody, and so on. It was a very comprehensive directive given by the court to the government to provide this data. After the government obviously was reluctant to provide the data. It sought reconsideration of that order from the court, but when the court ultimately directed them to produce the data, they did submit information to the court, but did not provide us with copies of the data provided and documents. Eventually, we got the court to direct them to provide us with copies. However, most of the compact discs that were given to us were corrupted and could not be opened. So until today, we do not have access to the information and documents that the government has provided to the Supreme Court. In addition to the access that we were hoping to get from the litigation in the Supreme Court, we had also filed several freedom of information requests from the government seeking information about the war on drugs. But again, our efforts to access this information were rebuffed by the government. So that leaves us in the dark, not only in terms of the numbers of people who have been killed in the name of the war on drugs, but as well in terms of accountability of those responsible investigations, cases, and prosecutions that have come out of this whole operations of the police. The Just to share with you some important features of what happened in the Supreme Court. Aside from the government having to submit these documents, and I understand these documents are now with the Supreme Court, in an extended resolution that they issued about 2 years ago, also pointed out that while the government had been continuously been claiming a presumption of regularity in their performance of their duties to justify the killings committed in the name of the war on drugs, the court was very clear in that resolution that the presumption of regularity does not apply. And I just want to share with you that portion of the court's resolution where the court said, and I quote, "The PNP cannot claim the presumption of regularity in official functions because deaths are not supposed to occur during any of their operations. The presumption of regularity in the performance of official duty must be seen in the context of an existing rule of law or statute authorizing the performance of an act or duty or prescribing a procedure in the performance thereof. The presumption also cannot prevail over positive averments concerning violations of the constitutional rights of the accused." The case, unfortunately, is still pending before the Supreme Court, although all the pleadings and memoranda have been submitted by the parties. The case has ended. The case has been submitted for resolution. No decision has yet been forthcoming from the court. That leaves us in a sort of state of legal limbo as far as the legality of the war on drugs is concerned. We have argued before the court that the circular issued by then PNP Chief De La Rosa is unconstitutional and invalid in several respects. First, because it authorizes the so-called neutralization and negation of drug suspects rather than their apprehension and prosecution. Second, because it violates basic constitutional principles of due process of law, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, and so forth, and other constitutional challenges that we included in our arguments. But until now, there has been no resolution from the court. I'd like to speak a little bit about how the law has been weaponized under this administration. This was it began, of course, with the war on drugs and the use of law enforcement and other means to so-called attack those behind the drug operations. But from there, it moved to a case that led to the incarceration of one of the senators of the Republic, Senator Laila de Lima, who is still in under detention today. Uh, from there, it went into the law was used to remove the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not by impeachment, which was supposed to be the only procedure for removal of a justice of the court, but rather by an unprecedented co-warrant of proceeding, which led to the removal of Chief Justice Lourdes Sereno. That the weaponization of the law then proceeded against the members of the media, the attacks on Rappler, the cases filed against Maria Ressa and Rappler itself, as well as the recent removal of the franchise of one of the largest television networks in the country, ABS-CBN. We thought perhaps that this weaponization of the law would be at least stifled by the current pandemic, but it hasn't stopped the government from continuing in this direction. During this public health emergency, as declared by the president, we have seen many netizens arrested without warrant simply for posting their opinions on Facebook and other social media platforms. We recently defended a teacher who was arrested without warrant and interrogated without counsel exactly for posting something on Facebook that the government did not like. Just a couple of weeks ago, the court, a local trial court, held that the teacher's arrest was unlawful and dismissed the charges against him. But this has become a pattern where netizens who have expressed their opinions against the government have been subjected to warrantless arrests, many of them at their homes, and then charged with various cases, including inciting to sedition, including violation of certain regulations that govern the public health emergency that's prevailing in the country. The recent passage of the anti-terror bill, and which is now a law, it should take effect in a couple of weeks, is another instance of the weaponization of the law. We have very big concerns that this new law will be used to go after critics of the administration and members of the opposition because it creates a new crime, the crime of inciting to terrorism, very similar to the crime of inciting to sedition and inciting to rebellion. Given the very broad and nebulous definition of terrorism in this new law, we fear that this law will be used again to go after critics of the administration in the same way that inciting to sedition was used to file cases against myself and others who had been candidates in the last elections, including Vice President Robredo, when later on the Department of Justice had to say that the evidence was not enough for those charges to be sustained and eventually dismissed those cases. But we fear that given the broad powers that the anti-terror bill is now providing the executive department of the government, that the government will have much more latitude in terms of going after and targeting um, critics, even ordinary citizens who would criticize the administration. So we do welcome the report, the findings and recommendations of the United Nations on the human rights situation in the Philippines, and we would want the international community to continue paying attention to what's happening here, because we believe that the world has to know what is happening here, and as far as we are concerned, the human rights defenders in the country, we will continue to fight for our rights and to defend the rights of people who are victims of human rights violations. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Attorney Chell. So the next speaker will be Father Tuts from the FDP, who will inform us about the situation on the ground, and also what are the trajectory of the human rights situations in the Philippines right now. So, Father Tots, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. Can you please unmute your microphone, Father Tots?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you, Miss Joy, and greetings. Good day to all who are with us. Fellow human rights defenders, members of the international human rights community, members of the diplomatic corps, and people, men and women of goodwill who believe on human dignity and of human rights. I like to start my sharing with this quotation. I'm going to tell Allah everything. This was the last words of a 3-year-old Syrian boy in 2015, when there was this airstrike, and the family, all of the members were killed, and he was brought to the hospital bleeding to death. And he said, "I will tell everything to Allah." In Filipino, we say, "Isusumbong ko kayo lahat sa Diyos sa inyong pinaggagawa." And this is also the cry of the orphans and mothers and the aunts and the grandmothers who lost their loved ones because of this war against illegal drugs. And so I remember last year there were around already thousands of dead bodies. And one of my colleagues, Miss Rose, asked, "How many dead bodies more that you want?" In the report, the victims of these extrajudicial killings, in the report presented last June 30 by the High Commissioner, uh, she had a figure of 8,663 people have been killed since 2015 to 2019. And we all know that it's more than that. There are those killed under the category of deaths under investigation. And that is why we ask the human rights community international through the Human Rights Council to come to the country and see by yourself, to investigate and to document, to see things, if we are telling the truth or the government is telling the truth. That's why we welcome the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights last June 30, presented in the Human Rights Council. We are positive in a way. It is another step forward in seeking accountability and justice for all the countless victims of the state's war on drugs, and its flip side, the war on dissent and opposition. And not only, we all know that also in the report of the High Commissioner, she mentioned about 200 plus killed from the ranks of the human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, trade unionists, farmers, agricultural workers. And this is the situation Miss Judy and Attorney Chell had already mentioned in details. We're in 2016, the day after President Duterte was sworn into the position, no? A human rights defender in Bataan by the name of Gloria Capitan uh, was brutally murdered in Bataan. And then the bleeding continued since then, every day. And is this part of the new normal? I don't think killing is a normal way to do, no? But every day you may hear cases. killings, series of killings, sometimes in one place or in separate towns and cities all over the country. That's why we say the police records may have 8,000 plus, but we say the human rights organizations uh, insist that it's more than that. And that's the cry of some mothers uh, and children whom we met whenever we go as TFD workers and volunteers. We go to them during the week to document and monitor and follow up the case. While some stood their ground and they are willing to fight back and defend their rights, but some submit to this. I'm gonna tell God everything. It's a pity. Uh, the plight of the bereaved families, the women, the children, the old and the young, brought by this war against illegal drugs. And the solution of the government is to kill, kill, and kill. And even during the pandemic, during the lockdown and quarantine, we have also monitored various violations of human rights, from cruelty, uh, inhumane treatment, intimidation. You know what? Some, of course, perhaps some were caught violating the curfew or the absence of a face mask or maybe the quarantine pass. But we cannot imagine how cruel people are. Those police or even in the village, those in the village, no, manning the checkpoints. Uh, there were cases we have monitored that some were detained and they were put in a dog cage, 6 of them. Some were asked to jog and so tired and they were refused water. Some were asked to do duck walk. Uh, some were put inside a coffin box. Uh, and they would say, well, this is part of disciplining the violators. Uh, and we have the Anti-Torture Act of 2009. So this is really uh, an irony. While the government is telling the international community that, hey, we respect and protect human rights, but torture is a daily uh, practice also being conducted. And being red tagged, we are harassed. In fact, some of our TFD uh, volunteers and staff in the Visayas, after they had documented the case of murder, the murder of some agrarian workers, agricultural workers, immediately after that, they got also threats, death threats, uh, by shooting them, and they know where they are leaving their families. So this is, but this is not normal, but this is happening, no? This is happening, the killings of trade union leaders, again, lawyers, and some church people also, church people, some bishops, some priests, some lay leaders in our parishes, in our dioceses, religious sisters and brothers are very vocal also in condemning these killings. Uh, but they would also just brush it out and then, oh, Father, get off from politics. You are only in charge of the spiritual aspects of the people. But that's not true. And Jesus, for the Christians, Jesus sided with the victims. Jesus sided with the poor, and he made it clear to his disciples. That's why, as task force in the Philippines, after 46, a task force is a temporary body. After it has served its purpose, it has to die naturally. But we were founded in 1974. And after 46 years, we are still around because human rights violations continue to rise, and it is worsening. In fact, this government is far worse than the Marcos dictatorship. And so we know the killing of Leonidas Cadencio Sequeña, a labor organizer, vice chairperson of Cavite chapter of Partido Manggagawa, a workers' party. He was killed last year, June 2, 2019, while the 41st session of the Human Rights Council was ongoing at the time. Our staff were being, members were harassed. And we have Leia Mandanhog Tumbalang. She was a member of the Wahunon tribe and a board member of Bukidnon Indigenous Peoples Advisory Council. And she attended our TFDP Human Rights Education Seminar. And there she expressed that she's also being warned and hunted. That was August 17, 2019. She was an active participant of our human rights education. A few days later, on August 23, she was killed by unidentified motorcycle riding assassins. But of course, she was a very active leader of the community. So we have documented violations of human rights during this pandemic. Also, we have 179 incidents of various forms of human rights violations. And prominent church personnel is Sister Mary Jan Manansan, a Benedictine sister. She was also red tagged, and Mr. Ritzley Santos, the executive director of Balaad Mindanao, an NGO. And also the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, where TFDP was a co-founder, was red tagged in Negros and elsewhere, together with Medical Action Group. And we are all aware of what happened to the freedom of expression about Brockler and Maria Ressa, and they shut down the ABS-CBN. And now we have the Anti-Terrorism Act, Republic Act 11479, which was signed by the president. This is the irony. While during the June 30 interactive dialogue, we were talking about constructive dialogue, domestic solution. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is willing to be of help, and the other UN special procedures, and all the member states were trying to encourage everyone. And for us also from the civil society organizations. And then all of a sudden, there's a plan to organize this body to probe the police operations in their conduct of whatever things that they are doing. And then it's ironic, no? Human rights, all of a sudden he signed the anti-terrorism law. We fear that a new wave of terror will be unleashed against those who dissent and those who oppose government policies. And we are feeling it now. It's happening. They just arrest people without a charge. In fact, that Pride March, sir, what's our violation? And nobody's answering them. They were just picked up, and then they were brought to a police station. The two-pronged approach of government may lead us back to an authoritarian order. The minds of the people are being conditioned to simply follow and not question government. Those who do raise questions are vilified online and offline. I'd like to end my sharing with, yesterday I watched a film entitled Romero. He was recently canonized by Pope Francis, a martyr of El Salvador. And he mentioned this: in the name of God, stop the repression. And I would like to echo that call, not just to tell God everything, but in the name of God, invoking God, stop the repression, the state terror, and the repression. And let me end by saying this: the single most damning rebuttal to the 100-page government human rights situation report is no other than the president himself and his pronouncements. It is his incitement to violation that enticement to violation that has led to a steep rise in human rights violations. And ultimately, accountability rests with the president. Now, in the name of the God of life, in the name of the God of life, when people play gods, when people play or act like gods and decide who have the right to live and who should die, that's playing gods. So, in the name of the God of life, stop the killings. And I'm speaking in behalf of the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, a mission partner of the Association of Major Religious Superiors in the Philippines, together with the concerned bishops, priests, pastors, religious sisters and brothers, and lay leaders. Stop the killings. Magandang hapon po.
Thank you, Father Toots. Apologies for the slight technical issues earlier that we were not able to give a proper introduction to Father Toots. But just very briefly, Father Christian Benefe is a council member of Carmelite Fathers. He's also a media and spirituality resource speaker and is a former director of the Institute of Spirituality in Asia. He's also the co-chairperson of the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, which is a human rights organization documenting human rights violation and conducting human rights education work, which is what Father Toots discussed earlier about the human rights violation in under this regime. Thank you, Father Toots. And then we'll move on to our fourth speaker. Our fourth speaker is Rose Trajano, the Secretary General of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates. Rose Trajano was elected as Vice President for FIDH in 2013. She was previously the Executive Director of Medical Action Group. She has an extensive record on human rights and children's rights in public and policy advocacy and UN advocacy, and on community health service and community development work. Ate Rose, we'll let you have the floor, and your slides are up.
Okay, thank you very much, Joy, and thank you for everyone who attended this webinar. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with the international community virtually. A very new methodology, and as I am quite used to face-to-face side events where we can immediately run after the permanent mission members after the meeting to continue our lobbying. So this is very new. We are also, of course, grateful with the Human Rights Council Resolution L20 that mandated for a human rights report to the Philippines, and which the Office of the High Commissioner produced a comprehensive report. May I also express our gratitude to the Philippine government for their detailed response to major concerns of the report, which I hope to cover major issues in my talk. Next slide, please. Yes. Navi Pillay was a former High Commissioner on Human Rights, and her article on accountability is what I want to use at this time. And we are very grateful with this very important and very relevant article, no, for the Philippines. Navi Pillay said, today no state can legitimately feign ignorance about the extent and causes of gross violations committed under its watch. This applies even if its own institutions do not pick up such violations as they should. The rule of law and institutional reform cannot start with a clean slate. Understanding the pattern of past human rights violations should be seen, and the worst violations should be carefully studied to end impunity for a successful transformative processes. And in the core of its accountability are three elements: the right to truth, the right to justice, and the right to effective remedy and reparations. Next slide, please. Allow me to mention some of our insights on the report pertaining to the elements of accountability. So when we say the right to truth in the report and as how we see it, there has never been an exact or verified figures on human rights violations under the war on drugs or even violations against human rights defenders. Even the Supreme Court decision was ineffective, as mentioned by Attorney Chell earlier. This Commission on Human Rights do not have access to law enforcement reports. And the authorities until now have no acknowledgement of violations and abuses. And lastly, of course, there are so many things in there, but what are the basis of tagging the church, the media, the lawyers, and human rights defenders as terrorists? Next slide, please. For the right to justice, it is very saddening to note that there's only one conviction on the war on drugs from the 4,500 investigated and more than 8,663 deaths. This is the most conservative data we have. The prison congestion is 534,000 nationwide because their cases cannot really be processed as fast as they should. And in some prisons, there are more than 3,000% congestion. Imagine how these people live inside detention. No government authority was penalized for the entry of 11 billion pesos worth of shabu, and it is lost in space. We don't know where the drugs are now. And there are only 13 convictions out of 386 cases of violations investigated from 2001 by Administrative Order number 35. I will be discussing it more later. Next slide, please. And the right to effective remedy and reparation, there's lack of harm reduction and comprehensive drug rehabilitation program. It's actually the police who are doing the rehabilitation program, which is violative of an international drug program policy. Human rights defenders and victim families are afraid to file cases because of fear of retaliation. And there's no systematic assistance to widows and orphans under the war on drugs or to HRDs have been provided. So in the report of the government, they have cited main mechanisms in relation to justice and accountability. Next slide, please. While the government mentioned the Ampatuan massacre conviction, it actually took almost a decade to have justice for the victims. However, despite the task force, the report of the Press Freedom Network documented numerous violations of journalists and media people and networks. Next slide, please. Another mechanism is Administrative Order number 35. No? This is the interagency committee for the investigation and prosecution of EJK, torture, enforced disappearance, and other gross human rights violations. Before this administration, we have close coordination with AO35 task force. It was established in 2012, and I remember precisely because I was attending the ICCPR report on the Philippines in Geneva when President Aquino signed it. But almost at the same time, the Capion massacre incident in Tampakan happened, where 5 family members were killed. This AO35 intention was really to investigate and prosecute past and current cases against political activists and against human rights defenders. No, it cited the Constitution, that no person shall be detained solely by reason of his political beliefs and aspirations, and that the state and non-state forces have been accused of silencing through violence and intimidation legitimate dissent and opposition raised by members of the civil society, cause-oriented groups. This is the reason why in the beginning we were closely working with AO35, because these are the cases we are handling. So actually when AO35 have been silent, no, we learned that they already included violations of international humanitarian law as additional incidences that will be investigated by AO35. No? But we have some questions. There are 13 convictions out of 383 cases, but there's no transparency. What are the cases being investigated? How many HRDs or political activists have been given justice? Where is the CSO participation in this AO35 right now? Well, next slide, please. Of course, we welcome the interagency panel to be established by the Department of Justice. This was mentioned by Secretary Guevara during the interactive dialogue. And I want to believe in his sincerity, in Secretary Guevara's sincerity. But it remains to be seen its transparency, its independence, and seriousness, and of course, most importantly, the political will of the government, or how it would implement its whole of nation approach for justice. And next slide, please. Let me enumerate the ways that we have been engaging with the government, including the security sector. In 2013, I think, the National Monitoring Mechanism on EJK killings and enforced disappearance and torture was established. But when Duterte became the president, actually has stopped. And the members of that National Monitoring Commission include the Commission on Human Rights, the Presidential Human Rights Commission, government agencies, including AO35, and PARA and 6 more CSOs are included in this monitoring mechanism. We also have a tripartite monitoring body for the implementation of the UPR, Commission on Human Rights, the PHRC, and CSOs. PARA was a member of the Multi-Sectoral Advisory Council of the PNP Human Rights Affairs Office during the President Aquino's period. Of course, we have to pull out from that advisory council when the killing started. We have an ongoing community-based dialogue project with the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Police Human Rights Offices, with the Commission on Human Rights and Alternative Law Group. We are partners since 2008. And very recently, just in November 2019, PARA was included to critique and assist the armed forces in reviewing and updating their human rights curriculum. Next slide, please. So we cannot really understand why, despite all these engagements, PARA have been vilified since the start of this administration. Maybe because we have been very vocal on the killings and war on drugs. As early as September 2016, we were warned by a ranking police officer from the Human Rights Office that I should be cautious as I am in the persons of interest list of the police. And when we asked around, we learned that we were even in the watch list of the armed forces, at least 5 leaders of PARA and iDEFEND. And it continued, especially after the release of Executive Order number 70. This is the whole of nation approach to end local communist armed conflict. In May 8, the Securities and Exchange Commission called PARA a terrorist. In July 2019, our bank accounts were threatened to be closed. In October 2019, staff of member organizations like TFD of the Philippines have been receiving death threats in Visayas and Mindanao. And in June 2020, iDefend, unfortunately, we just saw the name of iDefend. We really do not know if it's us, no, but it is now included in the report of the Philippine government to the Human Rights Council that iDefend is a communist-led network. Next slide, please. We were even tagged not only as terrorists, but a virus last April that needs to be eradicated. We were posted in Facebook by the 303 Infantry Brigade of the military in Negros. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry, please go back. Yes. And para member organization, Balaod Mindanao, and also serving as iDefense Secretariat in Mindanao, was also tagged in June as terrorist, as communist, as everything. Immediately after Balaod Mindanao, together with other organizations, LILAC, held a mobilization rally against the anti-terrorism bill. Next slide, please. EO 70 and its implementing rules, even at the lowest level of the community, are limiting us to do our work. They have requested village officials to draft their own implementing guidelines on how to do this EO 70. So we are limited. We have to register in LGUs, and our activities can be monitored anytime. While the anti-terrorism law will consolidate and institutionalize all repressive policies against legitimate organizations.
Rose, 1 minute.
Yes. This is only para and iDefend experience. And the experience of others are more gross, even to the point of killing. So we beseech, and call on the Human Rights Council and the international community. Maybe Hanong, you show the last slide. We just want to remind the Human Rights Council and the international community that you have this responsibility to ensure that human rights of all people, not only in the Philippines, but in the whole world, should be promoted, respected. But if there are any state who are violating human rights violations, then you should focus on that state and ensure that they will do their best. So we call on the Human Rights Council and the international community for an international, independent, and transparent fact-finding mission on the killings under the war on drugs and of human rights defenders. You should push for country visits of special mandates and refrain from all acts of intimidation and reprisals. We ask for immediate reparation, assistance, and psychological intervention to victims of human rights violations. We ask you to pressure our government for strong cooperation with the High Commissioner's Office, with the Commission on Human Rights, and CSOs to implement the recommendation of the report. And we are still requesting you to continue your mandate to the High Commissioner and continue their monitoring and documenting of situations of human rights in the Philippines. And in the absence of clear and measurable outcomes from domestic mechanisms, consider options for the international accountability measures. And finally, number 7 is not included in the recommendations of the report, but we beseech you, the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act may be the only safeguard we can have for human rights defenders against the Anti-Terrorism Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose, for that very comprehensive discussion, and also thank you for the pointers for our friends from the international community. Our last speaker is Commissioner Karen Gomez-Dumpit. Commissioner Karen Gomez-Dumpit has served the Philippine Commission on Human Rights through various career posts. She has advocated for the rights of persons deprived of liberty, which earned her Agawad Paglingkod Award from the Catholic Bishops' Conference. In her capacity as the focal director for migrant workers, she worked with civil organizations to partially lift the deployment ban of OFWs to Nigeria. She has been pivotal in the Commission's engagement with the UN Human Rights Council and with treaty bodies, which include reporting for the Universal Periodic Review, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Commissioner Karen?
I thank you. Good afternoon. My assignment for today is actually to cover the reaction to the government's plans after the report, and of course, the role of the Commission in exacting accountability for the human rights situation that we have today. No? Let me just run through my slides, and then I'll just interject along the way. So next slide, please. So I'm just pleased to share with you for a few minutes our role in the organization, and then to be able to do that, we'd like to just siguro try to capture in one word what we need to do. And well, the word that I came up with is to be a watchdog, and that's what we are, even in the Constitution. So let me just next slide, please. So here are some of the issues highlighted in the OHCHR report, but this is the outline of my presentation. Insights of the Commission on the issues raised, I'll mention that later on, and then actions taken by the government, by the Commission to exact accountability from the government on these particular issues. Next slide. So we've already, next slide, please. Okay. On the war on drugs, of course, we've heard a lot already, and we did say that since the start of the campaign against illegal drugs, we have expressed support for the campaign against criminality, but repeatedly denounced the methods that have been used. And we are for defeating illegal drugs, but the end obviously cannot justify the means. And we have to recognize the need to address the drug problem, but if methods are harsh and not in line with human rights, then we will not waver to question each and every step of the way as we have. Next slide, please. If we talk about the legislative agenda of this administration, it really zeroes in on what perhaps what we have described as a strong on criminality approach exclusively, or the strong arm approach. And this is, of course, the death penalty. Next slide, please. Minimum age of criminal responsibility, which we did mention in our statement in the Human Rights Council, that this must be removed if they want to show efforts that they are expanding the approach and not zeroing in on measures that we actually tell the world that we're reneging on our responsibilities as state parties to treaties, particularly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the second optional protocol aiming at the abolition of the death penalty, as well as in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the backsliding on the minimum age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 9. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the human rights defenders, this has been eloquently shared already by iDefend, by Rose. And this is something that is not found, as Rose indicated, the Human Rights Defenders Bill. We did not include this in our statement, the first statement in the Human Rights Council, the beginning statement, because we wanted to actually give a list of something that can be done in the short term. This is something that we wanted to advise government on, that if you want to show, these are the findings of the Human Rights Committee, there is impunity. It did not start from this administration. It actually started many administrations ago, and because of time, it built up this impunity. But right now, it's in an acute situation because you see that there is a brazen approval of the killings. There is encouragement. There's inciting to violence. There's misogyny and all that. So what we wanted to do was actually to give a list of something that they can do right away. And let me just recall that. First and foremost is remove the language, remove the harmful language, remove the harmful rhetoric, and that can easily be done in a flick of a finger. So you, if you stop that, then perhaps the thinking that this is an order from the top will stop as well. And we did say that this language must not be only verbal, but it's also in terms of the policy. And we've heard about the policies that were quoted, AO 35 and EO 70, and then the memorandum circular of the PNP when it was released in July 1. So the language should actually be also seen in policy. In fact, the OHCHR has said to repeal or to remove these memorandum circulars or these policy documents. And then, of course, it has been discussed previously also, is the full cooperation of the Philippine National Police with the investigations on the killings. Next slide, please. Of course, red tagging is here. No, we wanted to. This is also part of the language. This is also part of inciting violence, inciting hatred, demonizing groups that are actually just advocating for human rights, their human rights defender work. And this is something that's very relevant today because, as you know, the anti-terror bill has been passed, and this is something that we have to guard against as well. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we did mention press freedom in our statement, and this has to do with a lot of actions by government, the teacher who was arrested by NBI but later on was released, and then also Rappler and ABS-CBN as well. So we did say that there should be respect for democratic institutions as well as processes, including media for its role to inform the public and also to stimulate public debate. Next slide, please. So if we're going to take a look at what the commission will do, what's the role of the commission, we don't have to really look that far because it's in the Constitution. And if you take a look at our program of action in translating the constitutional mandates, it's really the three pillars of promotion, protection, and policy advisory. But we have a fourth one, which is really prevention of human rights violations. No? So let me just run through this. Next slide, please. So in terms of human rights protection, we will continue to ensure our investigation mandate, even if we have been facing a lot of difficulties. We did say we wanted full cooperation from the Philippine National Police, particularly the Internal Affairs Service and other government agencies, so that we can conduct a full human rights investigation into all these allegations. We do have our visitorial mandate. It has been shared. The horrendous, the conditions of our jails and the condition of our persons deprived of liberty. This is just a picture of what we uncovered as a secret detention facility or a secret jail in Rahabago in Tondo. And this was behind a cupboard or a bookcase. And this case is still ongoing. It's with the ombudsman. And hopefully we will get some updates on this soon. Next slide, please. Again, human rights protection, we cannot do it alone. We did partner with a lot of groups, legal aid groups, to help us. And in this case, it was CHR IBP. Next, the agreement. Okay. Policy advisories, we've had a lot of advisories, including the ones on the death penalty. We did our share in the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, and some other measures that have been regarded as really going back or eroding human rights obligations and eroding what we have built in terms of human rights progress of the past. No? So here you see the minimum age of criminal responsibility, death penalty, and the anti-terrorism. Next slide, please. And then, of course, reporting to treaty bodies. This is important. We did say in our closing remarks in the Human Rights Council that actually the Human Rights Council will still go on. It will still continue. And we did commit that we will report on the progress on the ground after this situationer that was done by the Office of the High Commissioner. But there are also other mechanisms within the UN. And coming up is actually our implementation report. It's the interactive dialogue with the treaty body, the Human Rights Committee. This will be held in October. The government will have to defend its record on civil and political rights in terms of their obligation on civil and political rights. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of promotion, we do have issued a lot of statements already. We have a lot of trainings are still going on, and right now, because of COVID, we have a lot of webinars that we have been conducting with our partners, with civil society, and also from within the commission. So human rights promotions is still an ongoing program of the Commission on Human Rights. Next slide. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is part, the previous slide was actually a survey that we have undertaken on the death penalty, and we did issue some of the findings outside of the core issue of death penalty. We asked about where people would get their news from, so that we know which medium to target, and it's still television. And this is something that we're trying to put out there. And this is one of the things that we said about ABS-CBN as being not being allowed to operate is really also a violation of the right to information, because as you know, ABS-CBN is actually has the widest audience reach, and in some areas that's the only television channel that's available in certain areas, especially now during the time of COVID. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I'm going to end there, but let me just zero in on my last point, which is actually our concluding remarks in the Human Rights Council session. And we did say that, of course, we welcome the government's efforts in coming up again with another review panel headed by the DOJ. But we wanted to also say that for this to be credible, there has to be certain parameters that has to be met. First of course, the coverage or the scope. A lot of these interagency mechanisms have actually attempted to narrow the scope of the investigation. Take for instance AO35, when it was actually signed by the previous administration. We did actually raise an issue of why only extrajudicial killings that are politically motivated. So these are the things that we wanted to see, or we want to see in this new panel. And they did say that they're committed to include us in this review panel, but there has to be greater transparency, and we need to have access to all those information, particularly the ones that are being held by the Internal Affairs Service of the PNP. And then, of course, the last part is the numbers. The numbers are important. But it's not the end all and be all of this particular exercise that we have today. And this is something that I think should be taken up by the review panel, because it's not only their numbers supposed to be that they're going to take a look at. It's also the other reports that have been out there and have been begging to be investigated, or to be taken up by government. And we have a lot of those. In fact, there was a study prior to well, many months ago. Ateneo and LaSalle, I believe, conducted a study of the unique names, and they came up at that time with 16,000. Now you have the Supreme Court saying it's 20 plus thousand. So even if there is a battle of numbers, I think there will still be cause for us to ensure that there is a case-by-case taking up of all these cases, so that we can fairly say that these efforts, right now, the review panel, would be credible enough. We're still hopeful, but a lot of doubt is still there. So, but we're to always have that open hand, have that openness to be able to work with government as well as with civil society, so that we can pursue and help establish domestic remedies on the ground. But of course, that being said, it does not mean that we will stop other mechanisms from doing its own thing, including the Human Rights Council progressing into, let's say, a commission of inquiry or a fact-finding mission, or the ICC, which is a separate mechanism as well. But what's important is, if we can take a look at case by case, we can probably start with the 5,000 that the government is saying that they would do it, but it shouldn't block us from asking them to investigate all the deaths that have happened as a result of the drug war. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Com Karen, for that brief on what CHR has done on human rights and on exacting accountability from the government. I think this is the time when we'll be able to open our floor for questions. And this is the first question is that Rose said there's only one conviction of human rights case. I understand fear factor or intimidation, but what can be done to encourage to help victims to file cases? If anyone wants to answer this, perhaps Com Karen, a CHR.
Yes, no, we did cover this in our statement, and we did say that there has to be just to say no, and I'd like to go back to what the former High Commissioner said, Nabi Pillay. She said, of course, the rights to truth, access to justice, and effective remedies. No? But to be able to do that, you have to have a lot of confidence building measures because a lot of people are really afraid. And this is something that we can work on. And we did say to account and locate each and every killing in the justice system. Because if you take a look at it and plot it like in a graph, you will see that a lot of dots representing cases are all in the IAS or in the internal affairs. It's not progressing into the prosecution level. If you take a look at the cases that we have actually monitored, we have already investigated only 4,000 of those cases. 11 are at the court level, only 11. And there's one conviction, as you said, no? And then prosecution level is only 16, ombudsman 17, and then in PNP-IAS it's 52. So if you try to locate all of that, then that's I think somehow a confidence building measure na nagpo-progress or the cases are progressing. Effective protection for victims, whistleblowers, and witnesses. I did mention this in my interview with Christian Esguerra the other day on ANC. And I did say that, you know, the police as an organization, we can condemn it as an institution. But I think there are many officers who would like for this to stop. And there should be effective protection for whistleblowers as well. And then, of course, prosecution para lumakas ang loob so that other victims can come forward. That's also a confidence-building measure. But, of course, we have to secure, let's say, witness protection, not only with government, but also with other sanctuaries that we call. And it should be safe for them. So the commission somehow has a witness protection program, but it can hardly rival the resources that government has. So this is something that perhaps civil society and the commission can work on so that we can build the confidence of our victims. Of course, legal representation is also indispensable, but we have FLAG and the other legal groups to help us with that. But it's really safety. That's really the number one concern. So we have to address it.
Thank you, Com Karen. Anyone else wants to address the question on how we can support, what can be done to help victims file cases? If not, we'll move on to our next question. How do you address the wrong perception of the public about the role of the CHR? I think this is also for you, Com Karen.
We fight with facts. We've actually set up our and try to actually grab back the narrative of what the Commission on Human Rights actually stands for. And then, of course, we rely on our allies, our civil society partners, as well as our own constituencies, the ones that we built over time, over the past few years, no? And there's no way to go about it. We just have to fight with the truth, and we just have to up our game in terms of communications, but also up our game in terms of delivery of services. No? In investigation, it's quite difficult because there is almost non-cooperation. It's not even lack of cooperation. And this is something that I'd like to also highlight here. We did say that the government must accept that the killings are widespread and systematic. Okay, we did fall short of saying the state is responsible for all these killings because we still need to investigate that. So in terms of that, there also has to be an admission that there is also a pattern of widespread and systematic denial of information with the Commission on Human Rights. It's almost zero cooperation. I've been with the Commission for 27 years and I have not seen this kind of level of non-cooperation from an institution because it comes from the top.
Thanks, Karen. Second question. What is your opinion about the government steps to form an interagency task force to investigate the killings? Perhaps we can ask Ate Rose, do you want to start? You're on mute po.
Yeah, I think I have already said my piece about that. It remains to be seen or not seen, but I hope we can see it actually. We have been a member, with the Commission on Human Rights on all possible mechanisms that we can really seek justice. As I mentioned in my presentation, the questions would be on its transparency, on its independence, and the political will of the people. Even if Secretary Guevara has the sincerity to really do that, and I believe he does, because he actually declined the nomination for Supreme and Associate Justice, so that he can focus on the Department of Justice. That is very hopeful for us. But again, we really have to see it. But anytime we are needed, we will be there to help.
Thank you. Father Toots, do you want to share your thoughts on your opinion about the government steps on the interagency task force on the killings?
Yeah, as what Ms. Rose had said, that remains to be seen. There have been efforts before with the Presidential Committee on Human Rights and some dialogues, but again, it stops sometime, somewhere. So we have to be open. Of course, the attitude is openness. At the same time, critical also to to their intention. I'm going back. I want to also add to Commissioner Karen's response to that perception about CHR. I think and I believe in general the Filipinos are not aware of what human rights are. It's an alien term, and some of my colleagues, to be honest, some priests, some religious don't even know what are human rights and the role of the government and the citizens. So I think human rights education must be integrated in our school curriculum, that everyone should be aware of that. It's not only CHR, the not so good perception on the CHR's role, but human rights in general. I think that's why human rights education must be embedded at least in our basic education, so that everyone knows what are your rights, what are your wrongs, what are things to be done, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Toots. And I think we'll have our next question for Attorney Chell. So, National Security Advisor Hermogenes Esperon on Saturday said on the terror law, if they are quiet and peaceful, they shouldn't be worried. This is in response to a concern that the terror law might cover people who participate in protests. How do we counter this narrative that the people should not fear the terror law unless they support terror groups?
I think the statement of Esperon shows the kind of chilling effect that the law will have once it takes effect in a few weeks. His statement is really an indirect way of saying to everyone, just keep quiet and nothing will happen to you. But that's the antithesis of the democracy that we're supposed to have in the country. And I think that's the wrong message that the government is sending. There's no law really that will ever cow us into submission, but I know that the government will exert every effort, people in the government will exert every effort to, make people quiet down. And what Esperon said is just an example of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Attorney Chell. And Rose, you also said that you wanted to answer that question.
Yes, I agree totally with Attorney Chell, but just very vivid example of what happened during the COVID pandemic for a teacher, a teacher who is not silent because he was so frustrated, he was so disappointed that he has to express himself. And he was charged with inciting to sedition. And the anti-terror law has not even been passed then. So what signal is the government sending to all of us?
Thanks, Rose. Next question. How do we protect human rights defenders who are being targeted as terrorists and communists, especially now that they are receiving death threats? And an additional question to that, would the human rights defenders law actually have any effect given the lack of compliance to human rights by this government? Should we perhaps ask Judy? Judy, are you here? Ah, okay. She's having problems with the video. Okay, perhaps we'll start with Father Toots first.
How do we protect the human rights defenders? That's the problem with the. Of course, we work for the passing of the human rights defenders bill, no, to be approved, but of course it is not perhaps one of the priorities of this government. Um, I want to uh, challenge the human rights defenders to assert their rights. For example, for my case, I am not a member of any political party. I am just, I am a Christian. I am moved by my faith, and I believe that the right to life is the highest form of all rights, because the other rights, right to property, right to due process, will just follow. But I should be alive. And so once this is violated, teka muna, wait, you cannot just do that. So I think we have to assert our rights. But that's why the problem with anti-terror, for example, I love taking coffee. If I will take coffee with someone and who is a target of this government, then I am also a suspect because he's my friend or she's my friend. So it's so absurd. The terrorism law is really a disaster to us, no. But some people don't see it that way, no. Uh, you should not be afraid if you are not doing something wrong. Yes, but to be critical and to be vocal about it. Killing has no place in a civilized society. That's a political statement, but that is also a moral statement. That is a religious statement. And I am impelled to say it as a Catholic priest, as a human rights defender, something like that. So we have to assert our rights, and we have to unite. We have to work together for the betterment, and that would be our concrete contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Toots. Judy, you back?
Yes,
Okay.
but I'm without video. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. So the question is, how do we protect human rights defenders who are being targeted as terrorists, and particularly for people you work with, like the indigenous peoples? How do we protect them, especially now that they're receiving death threats?
Yeah. The very first thing that we were discussing amongst ourselves is that they have to understand, while they have to understand the the harsher context that we are in right now. Before the anti-terror law, they have been receiving threats already. The communities, the indigenous communities, have been at the receiving end of all kinds of threats from actual killings. But with the anti-terror law, it has been institutionalized. And impunity has just been institutionalized as well. And so we have to understand, we meaning along with the communities, have to understand that this is harsher. We are more insecure than ever. And therefore, all the other ways of working before should be revisited and have to be more cautious about it. Um, the, the indigenous communities have their way of providing protection amongst themselves. But given the insecurity now, the way the local governments have infiltrated their communities with this task force ECLAC, or the ending local communism, it has at the local level, no, it has encouraged division amongst communities, and that is also proving to be very how do you say this, very dangerous and very difficult for the communities. And so new ways of working and reaching out to broader people outside their communities is more crucial now. But again, it's becoming more difficult as well, because now there are still some lockdowns, there are still some checkpoints, and so it's not easy for them to move around. And given that they are in areas where there are no signals, phone signals, this is really proving to be very, very challenging. And so we lend as much as we can. We lend our voices to tell their stories and to bring to them what's happening at the national and policy level, so that they can prepare themselves and that they can plan properly what to do next, especially in the face of all of these reports and announcements that more mining will be encouraged, and more plantations will be encouraged to beef up our national economy. And so yeah, it's a challenging time, but more than ever they need our solidarity and they need our working together. Yeah.
Okay. And Judy, since we have you now, we have a question. You mentioned that the economic growth during Duterte has led to an increasing inequality. But about half a year ago, the government presented data which indicated that poverty incidence had decreased from 23% in 2015 to 16% in 2018. Quite a remarkable decrease in poverty in just 3 years. Could you please comment?
Yeah. But then let's look at what kind of economy we have right now and what kind of development we're pursuing. As I mentioned before, it's the development that we're pursuing are extractive, commodification of natural resources. And so we are feeling right, especially with the pandemic, the indigenous communities are telling us, especially the indigenous women, if the pandemic happened a decade ago, maybe we could still run to our forests and get some food from there, given the lockdown. But now it's something that they cannot do because forests have been decimated. They have been moved from one area to another because of the land grabbing that is happening. And so whatever the numbers that the government are presenting, these are not reflected in the lives of the communities, not just indigenous peoples, but even the rural communities who are at the end of all of these extractive and exclusive development framework that is being pushed by this kind of an economy of the Duterte administration.
Thanks, Judy. If anyone wants to add to Judy's response? No. Okay. We have 5 minutes left. Oh, Rose wants to?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador, for your question. Some of the criticisms we have from the CSOs against government statistics is sometimes they usually change the indicators just to suit, or to fit a more rosy picture of the economy. But the impoverished people really cannot feel this trickling down effect. Like, for example, we were surprised that at one time, of course, the NEDA said that If you are earning 10,000 pesos for each family, then you are above poverty level. How can that be? 10,000 pesos is only $200. Huh? At one point, there was even an indicator that if you can buy 2 bottles of beer, you are not poor anymore. So what kind of indicators do we have like that? Perhaps we should really study, scrutinize these indicators. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. And Father Toots?
Yeah, just a rejoinder. Poverty is massive. It's systematic. So this survey thing is sometimes questionable. Before the pandemic, and more so, it has worsened during this time. People just uh, don't have food to eat. In fact, a friend had told me, or someone had told me, that to eat 3 times a day is a vice. No, no, it's not a vice. Hindi bisyo. It's a right. No, no, no. Because we have nothing to eat. No work, no pay. The informal settlers in the urban centers and in the rural areas. So poverty is systematic and has embedded in all areas of society, of the Philippine society. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Toots. We also want to welcome here representative from Aicher, Yuyun. Rep Yuyun, if you want to ask or say a few words, we're giving you speaker access now. Hello.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for the speakers. I watched the Human Rights Council of, so last week. Sorry, and then also I've been making a statement addressing the Philippines issues so far. Since last year, since Maria Ressa, and then now this year on Maria Ressa, as well as the ABS-CBN, and the latest statement I made was about the Anti-Terrorism Act. So it's becoming our concerns. Our mean Indonesia, ICHR Indonesia. I cannot speak on behalf of other representative in ICHR. As of now, we have not been able to table the issue of Philippines in our meeting. We have been tabled a lot of issues like on Rohingya, on internal displaced people, but it I found rather difficult to start the discussion without enough uh, reason. Uh, so because for the issue of Rohingya, the ASEAN leaders have been addressing the issue for years, and then they come up with the agreement on the repatriation. So there was there was a recognition of the issue. There was a recognition that we should do it together. On the issue of Philippines, uh, I don't have enough, not evident, but if I base my reason to table the issue of Philippines based on the news, the news that we receive, I know I will be challenged by saying that these are the fake news. So I would be very appreciative if NGOs in the Philippines can send us complaints about the issue uh, um, in the Philippines to ICHR with the email of ICHR at ASEAN.org. So I will have a background, a reason, argument why we need to discuss this in the meeting of ICHR. However, I cannot promise you anything. It's just what I've been doing for the issue of Rohingya, for instance. We want Myanmar know that we know the issue. we watch the issue, we are care about what is happening in your country. To what extent we make impact to the life of Rohingya, we don't know. But I always believe that we need to grab all potential possibilities to discuss about human rights in the region, even though ICHR has been seen as quite weak, uh, but but it would be good to be mention some of the issues and record it in the official document. So whoever will be sitting in this position will know that we have discussed this before, and now it is a time to continue the discussion. So that has been my approach in dealing with number of issues: communication, lack of protection, stakeholder engagement, any issue. So I always table that this is not new issue. This has been discussed before, and this is the time for us to continue the discussion. Unfortunately, on the issue of Philippines, we hardly discuss. I've read all the summary report from 2009. I did not see issues of the situation in the Philippines has been discussed, unless in the break time, in the break coffee break time. Uh, in very casual, it is not necessarily mentioned in the official document anywhere. But again, I would like to invite civil society to send us the complaints, so we can have a discussion. And again, I don't, because in ICHR, in the last discussion in relation to developing the 5 years work plan, Philippines always appear as very progressive. uh, Table the idea of the protection of human rights defenders, for instance, with the name of human rights champion, human rights registry, human rights award. So I understand this actually Philippines tried to address the need to highlight the work of human rights defenders. So there is a different kind of behavior and an attitude perhaps at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level. The way I see it, this is an opportunity to discuss. If Philippines is not feeling threatened at the regional, it means we can discuss the issue more constructively. Because I saw a number of countries are not feeling comfortable talking human rights at the regional level. But so far, in the last 1.5 years, I found yes, Philippines make a lot of selection on number of issues, even on the discussion in relation to CRC general comments. Philippines intentionally removed the discussion on the limit of age for criminal liability. But um, to me, that's only strategy. But the willingness of Philippines to talk about human rights at the regional level, that to me an opportunity to talk about human rights issues of the Philippines at the ICHR. So yes, that's my response. I'm standing in solidarity with the civil society in the Philippines. I've been following the issue. I take a note. I make a lot of statement if needed to express my concerns. I've been protested by the Philippine government uh, uh, 1 or 2 times, but it doesn't matter. I think that's a risk of being the Human Rights Commissioner. I think Karen also have this kind of challenges. I think that's common everywhere. And this is something that we know already from the beginning of being the Human Rights Commissioner. So that's and thank you very much for sharing your insights and concerns. I make a lot of notes from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Yuyun. And I think we're about to end, so just a quick wrap up. Thanks all for all your points and for all your pointers. So the OACHR in its report highlighted the need for an independent investigation and requested members of the Human Rights Council to support accountability measures should domestic mechanisms fail. The government's commitment towards a domestic mechanism to investigate the killings seems to come a bit too late, although civil society has expressed their interest in transparent mechanisms. And the Philippines' continued denial of these violations and also the recent signing of the anti-terror law demonstrates its disregard toward recommendations and concerns by the UN High Commissioner. Our speakers here have mentioned how they have faced reprisals and vilification as human rights defenders and for demanding accountability from this government. The Human Rights Council and the diplomatic community should continue to monitor the human rights developments and to support international accountability measures. An international investigative mechanism should be the Council's next step. While the OHCHR report was a significant step towards understanding the extent of violations in the Philippines, we cannot let it stop there. The need for international accountability remains ever clearer. And that's it from us. I think we have 2 minutes, so I can ask all our participants, starting from Judy, to speak for 30 seconds each as your last words for this
Alright.
webinar. 30
Yeah.
seconds, ma'am.
All right. The human rights situation in our country is worsening by the day, but we in LILAC and we in iDefend remain steadfast in our advocacy, in our struggle for democracy and for human rights. But as I said in my presentation, we need more eyes to monitor what's happening here and more voices as we continually are being gagged, our voices muffled. But we are part of a growing people's movement. We're tired of violations of human rights and of violence. And so we continue to resist this authoritarian government, and we will continue to broaden our ranks. We hope that our comrades and friends and allies in the international community will stand by our side in solidarity as we wage this very difficult, fear-filled resistance. Magandang gabi sa ating lahat. Good evening.
Thank you, Judy and Father Toots.
So we have to stand our ground, human rights defenders and those who believe in human dignity. We have to resist all forms of state terror and, of course, tyranny and authoritarian rule. Above all, let's value life. That's all.
Thank you, Father Toots, for joining us. And Rose?
Again, maraming salamat po. The High Commissioner's report does not end last June 30, no? It's actually the beginning of our struggle to ensure that all the recommendations will be implemented. And we have that responsibility, and the government have its obligation. And we're counting on the international community to help us out, no? If we want human rights situation in the Philippines to improve, then let's all do it together. Stay safe, but not silent. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. And Commissioner Karen?
Just to say, the world is watching, and we will help watch what's happening here. We will help inform the public about what's happening here. We will continue to monitor the developments arising out of this interactive dialogue. From one mechanism to another, we will be always here to stand up for human rights. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Karen. And we'd also like to acknowledge our diplomatic partners and the international community who have continued to support Philippine civil society in the Human Rights Council and in the Philippines. And with that, we're going to have to end this online side event, and we thank you all for your participation. We apologize that we were not able to cover all the questions, but we will be distributing it to our speakers, and we will be sending it to people who registered. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat.